Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Morning.
And I thought before the meeting, I'd tell you that we're still working hard with the resurrected church people to come to some decisions. They're really nice people. Faith-based institutions present quite the quandary when we're dealing with land use.
Yeah, I'm glad they've been working so closely with you, though. I really think that's wonderful.
Yeah, and we've been enjoying it. We're actually hosting a community meeting on Monday evening. If you want to pop on, I could send you the link, but because they want to press forward with Thursday's planning commission. I'm guessing they're on the agenda for next Thursday.
I believe so. Yeah, I think the agenda will be published today, but yeah, that's my understanding. So yeah, I knew. Is that the Councilmember Lee's district meeting on Monday?
No, she decided not to host one without talking to any of her constituents.
Okay.
So we've formed an organization out here called Friends of District 33 that's here to do things that maybe wouldn't get otherwise done that should get done. Primarily communication between neighbors and other stakeholders like this. So
Gotcha. Okay, so that's what that meeting is, and is it just for that, just for the church, or will you be talking about other projects?
no, it's just for the church.
Okay. Okay.
I mean, there's a bunch of other stuff out there, but there's a bunch of other stuff out here.
One thing at a time, huh?
Which case is that?
Hello.
I'm not familiar with what's going on. What case is that, John?
I don't know the case number. It's
I'm just not familiar
Hamilton
with the church and what's going on there.
It's Hamilton Church at what is it? Bell Road, Hobson Pike. They call it Hobson Pike.
Yeah, Hobson Pike and Hamilton Church. There's a church that's going through a policy change and a rezoning to allow the church. They also want some leasable office space, so that's why they need the changes.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Sean, I realize it's this laptop that I'm on that's making it come up DCV 1723.
That's
But
okay.
in other meetings, not WebEx, but another meeting, my name comes up. So that's where I am with this one.
You know, WebEx is a little bit of a mystery every time. So we're just glad you were able to join, and we will not worry about what it says your name is. We'll just call you by your name. So very glad to see you today, Ruby.
Good to see you too. And thank you for the response. Who was that? Yes, that was very, very helpful. That's the information that I needed. The question I asked about the sinkhole.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that it was just general for now, but I can see it coming down the pike later. So I was just trying to make sure I had an understanding. And so that was very helpful. So it had nothing to do with the cluster lot options. I just needed to ask that question while we were talking.
That's quite all right.
Yeah, in case a sinkhole comes up. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we always try to get folks connected if they've got a question. We aren't always the right people to answer. In that case, I had to check, but
yeah, but you got the answer I needed. Thank you very much.
So we will give just another couple minutes in case anyone is trying to join us, and then I'll get started so we can not hold you guys too long on this beautiful Friday.
I'd like to proffer the idea that we make George Ewing the chair of our group. He has done a heck of a job of research and presentation of alternative methods. Thank you, George. You're the man.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, John. I don't know if the chat is working this time, but my first response was, wait a minute. Uh, yeah, no, I was just looking to foster conversation between the neighborhood advocates, and I'm grateful for this opportunity to bring those folks together. And there is a downside to the type of obsessiveness that I have in that pretty much every email is a tome. So thank you all for your patience.
Yeah, the only complaint I have or suggestion that I have is increase the size of your font for us old people. Not you, Ruby, me.
Yeah, with my eyes as well, I've had to learn how to zoom in and out on email. So I apologize. I don't know what my operating system is formatting the default font, but it is definitely too small. And my apologies.
I'm kidding you, man. I know Twana Chick is trying to get online
She
in
has,
some fashion.
I saw in the chat, the TW, she's having the same challenge that Ruby is. The TW is Twana. So I think we have her. And that's who we're looking at in the TW box this morning. So, okay, well, I'll go ahead and get us rolling. And then if others are able to join, they can catch up as we go. George is sort of beating me to my first question. I saw in the chat was a question. Obviously, I think you guys were all here last time, so we'll keep ourselves muted unless we're speaking so the audio works well. But the first thing I wanted to do was see how the chat is working for folks today. So can everyone see if you can find the chat box and see if you can get it to change? I'm looking.
You just want to know if we can see it? I can see it.
Yeah, do you have the ability to chat with everyone, Ruby? Can you select everyone as an option?
Yeah, I can see a drop down that says everyone.
Okay, great. Okay, so hopefully that means that we're not going to be having the same issue last time. I think last time there were several folks who could chat, but only with the host. So they weren't able to send a message that the whole group could see. It was a weird technical issue. And we actually had to have our IT folks report it to the software maker. But hopefully this is an indication that it's fixed. If at any point something goes awry with the chat, you can let us know. We'll get your messages either way. But you know, if you're feeling like you can't see what's going on, just keep us posted. But hopefully it's working better today. And then I also just wanted to remind everybody that we are recording this, and we'll get you that link once it's available to us, so that you can review as needed. And then it will also help us out as we go back and sort of think through your questions and comments. So that is happening again as well, just as it was last time. And to start, kind of a reminder of where we've been and where we left off. Last time we talked a little bit about the purpose of these conversations and the process that we're going through. And we did have a few questions from folks about sort of what's driving this or why we're doing this now. And so I wanted to remind the group that these conversations are coming out of direction that the Planning Commission gave to staff. They had heard comments and concerns from neighbors and others when these kinds of developments are presented to the commission. And so they asked us to take a look and evaluate the tool and talk to different stakeholder groups and really try to figure out what the issues are and if there's some adjustments that need to be made. So that's why we've embarked on this journey. And we're really grateful that y'all are here and able to give us your thoughts. Sorry, I'm hot on the mouse trigger this morning. And then last time we also, we spent a bit of time on, sort of background education, what the cluster lot auction tool is and how it works. And since all of you were here, I'm not going to dive back into this, but there will be some opportunity to kind of talk about it more and ask questions as we go through the information we hope to cover today and as we just go through discussion. And then finally, we talked briefly about the issues that we've heard with this tool so far. And that's sort of where I'd like to have us begin for today. So as a reminder, we have heard some opposition. The Planning Commission has gotten some opposition in some cases, and staff was trying to evaluate sort of what kinds of concerns or questions that they were getting. And we sort of identified 3 different categories or themes of sort of potential issues with this tool. The first being sort of the open space or the environmental protection aspect of it. So I think a lot of times the commission will review a proposal that uses this tool and they hear comments that the open space is maybe kind of just the leftovers or that it's not of great quality or it's maybe not protecting the right things or sometimes that it's not usable, right? Sometimes there are neighborhoods where they want the open space to be an amenity or a place to play. And so sometimes those kinds of comments come in. I think we also frequently hear kind of on the flip side of that, that the development that results from the cluster lot option doesn't fit with the neighborhood, that the lots are too small or the development pattern is too different and it feels foreign or it feels like not the right kind of approach. And I would say that that comes up more frequently when we see this kind of proposal in an area where there are already a lot of existing neighborhoods, but not always. So just kind of questions about neighborhood character. Are we taking good care of that in situations where we need to? And then finally, and I think this is what we got into a little bit last time, sort of concerns or different understandings about how the current zoning works and how this tool relates to how many lots you can achieve on a property. And we talked about some about that at the end last time, but we'll go through it in a little more detail today in case that's helpful. So really, I think when we kind of hear all these different categories of concerns, what it kind of points to us is that we're in a balancing act here. So we have existing zoning across the county that was applied in the 70s or the 90s or more recently, and it's out there and it is what it is. And only the property owner or a council member could alter that. So we're kind of dealing with what's there. But we also have these goals for environmental protection or open space creation. And then we have these goals for neighborhood character, right? We want people to feel that their neighborhood feels right and works well for them. And I think the current cluster lot option tool is trying to balance all 3 of those things at once. So the standards, I think it's fair to say the way the standards are written in the code is not super well organized, but if you break out what they're all trying to do, they're really trying to balance all 3 of those things. Take the existing zoning, get some open space or some environmental protection, and also make sure that if there's surrounding development, the impact of those smaller lots is mitigated in some way. And sometimes in certain settings or if the site is small, it can be hard to do all of these things at once. And I think when that happens, that's really when we hear from the public or stakeholders that they're concerned or that it isn't working quite well. So I think a lot of what we'll try to focus on today is sort of exploring through this process whether there are adjustments that can be made to the standards so that that balance works better. And maybe how we want to balance those different things isn't the same everywhere. Maybe there are certain kinds of sites or neighborhoods or areas where we want to prioritize one of these things over the other. I think, we all love to achieve everything everywhere, but that may not always be possible. So as we kind of think through some options, just keep in mind, like we want to kind of there is a balance. There may be some trade-offs, and what do you think is important to prioritize in certain areas? That's kind of, and the other thing I would say is a lot of the questions that we heard from this group last time were really asking about or diving into or pointing at these same kind of categories of issues. We had a couple folks asking, like, how is the open space maintained? Who's protecting that? We had a couple folks asking, how do we figure out how many lots it is? So I think that the kind of issues that we had heard in advance, you guys sort of confirmed for us that those are the same kinds of issues or questions that you're having about this tool, which is good. I think it means we're sort of focusing on the right things. But as we go through this, certainly if you're identifying other challenges or things you think on our radar, that's part of what we want to hear. So I'll kind of pause there really briefly and say we're going to move into potential solutions. Does anybody have a kind of high-level question about the issues that you want to ask before we kind of roll into the next section? Oh, John, if you're speaking, you might be muted.
Sorry. At some point, I want to talk about data-driven decision-making. I don't know where it will be pertinent, but a lot of the stuff that we're talking about is kind of not necessarily scientifically derived analysis by community members. And I'd like to know what's been going on with cluster lots in the county. So
sure.
wherever that fits in, we can talk about it.
Yeah, I think we can. I'll sort of try to give you what we have seen as we go through each of the issues. I think, as basically staff went through the exercise of trying to identify all of the concept plans that the commission had considered. And a concept plan is just a preliminary plan for a larger subdivision. That's how they see these kind of proposals. And we took a 4-year period between 2016 and 2020, and they saw 75 applications for these types of larger subdivisions, and half of those use this tool. So it's this particular set of standards is not something that gets used every time. In fact, it's kind of closer to 45 or 50% of the time. So that's kind of one thing to keep in mind as we go forward. And I'll certainly try to interject some other data that we have as we go. It's a little, I think at any time we talk about data, it's important for you guys to know the caveats. And I think that Gordon Stacy asked this question last time. Sort of one of the challenges to these is that historically, they haven't always been tracked in a consistent way. Like they don't always come through with a big label that says cluster lot. And so we had to sort of manually search for them. But we've really tried to make sure that we're capturing, at least over that period, how many were going on and sort of what those would, what form those took. So I will, but we can definitely keep touching on that as we go. And I think Swana had some comments or questions last time that were kind of about data, but in a different way, sort of like what kinds of environmental data do we have, or how are we maybe analyzing what features are out there. So we'll see if we can keep coming back to that too. I see that Ruby had a hand up, and then George,
Yeah.
and I don't know if that was the right order, but we'll go to Ruby first.
Okay, and I think you kind of answered my question in a roundabout way, but I was going to ask a question about when you were talking about identifying issues, and you were pointing out about the zoning, environment, and the character on that screen. We're going to be looking at these, like you said, Are we going to be looking at them case by case, or what are we trying to do? I guess, what is the end result again, if you can tell me what we're trying to accomplish, a bill, a rule, or what?
Absolutely. So those kinds of issues are actually the standards of this tool, right? So if someone wants to utilize the cluster lot option, there's a set of regulations in the zoning code that they have to review and follow. And those regulations govern things like how much site area do you need to be eligible to utilize this tool. It sets out how much open space you have to dedicate, you know, what size the lots can be, those kinds of things. And so what we're going to do is try to think about those issues, but now this conversation today will be trying to back into how might we adjust those regulations to better achieve our goals. And you know, I think you're actually, you're transitioning us really nicely into how the next part is going to work. So I'm going to skip one slide, but not because I'm going to preclude George from getting his question answered, just so that I can finish answering yours, which is that we're going to try to ask you guys to give us some feedback on broad directions for change. And all of this is going to be sort of geared toward what ideas do you have that would make this tool work better? And we'll give you some suggestions to kind of get things flowing. But you're basically going to help us make sure that we've got a broad list, but you don't have to worry about how to turn those into zoning standards. We think about the zoning code all day long. We have experience trying to write it. So we're basically going to try to do some translation, where you just get to talk about this in the way that you know it, and give us your ideas or your questions, and we'll figure out how to translate that into zoning standards. And then if we get through this process and there are changes that should be made, the way that will happen is that there will be a proposal to amend the text of our zoning code, and that will come through the Planning Commission for a recommendation and a public hearing, and then it will actually go on to Metro Council, and they'll go through 3 readings. So it's the same process you were probably familiar with from when someone wants to change the zoning on their property, but instead of changing the zoning on a specific property, we're actually going to change, it would change the language of our zoning code as it applies to all kinds of properties. So that's kind of the process we would go through. So, okay, great. George, did you have a question before we move forward?
I'm going to go ahead and take the mic since it's open. These are questions that are probably going to be better answered once we get into your possible solutions. But looking at the 3 fronts that we're looking to address, you know, this poor open space yield, this poor fit with character, and then misunderstandings about lot yield and zoning entitlement. The concept that I introduced or started a conversation between the neighborhood advocates was the difference between gross area and net buildable area, and some calculation for creating a net buildable area and what would be considered available to that. And then that would also trickle down in helping positive yield of open space, depending on how that calculation is constructed. And then as far as your fit with character, if it's possible that different calculations of either the open space qualifications or the net buildable area of a subject parcel were catered either to transect or adjacent zoning, those kind of things. And then I forgot, and I don't mean to open a can of worms, but I forgot if you were, or didn't catch if you were referring to changing zoning code as part of the possible goal of this ask from the commission, if that includes and or means the subregs and or maybe the rural subregs. And if we can, so those are the high level questions, and I may regret having opened that can of worms, but thank you.
So a few thoughts there. I'm glad actually that you just used the terms gross and net. We had given some thought since our last conversation for a different way to describe that. that issue, and those are some terms that we landed on as well. So I'm excited to get to that because it sounds like y'all have had your thinking caps on, and maybe we'll be able to have a good conversation there. As far as what we're amending, so the cluster lot option is a set of zoning code standards, and the reason it gets utilized, those zoning code standards get utilized when land is subdivided, but they live in the zoning code because they establish the lot size, and that's considered a power that's reserved to Metro Council. So if we want to change any of the cluster lot standards, we'll be amending the zoning code to do it. As to your question about the subdivision regulations, it's not our intent to alter those with this process. It would be, I think, the changes would fit into the cluster lot option. And then obviously if someone's proposing a subdivision, they'll meet both. And you know, the rural subdivision regulations in particular, they reference the cluster lot option. So I think that if there are changes accomplished here, it will have the effect potentially of coming into play in a rural subdivision, but it wouldn't be altering the rural subdivision standards themselves. So, okay, I got some thumbs up there. So hopefully that helps. Okay, so Anna, did you see any questions or things in the chat that we need to address before we kind of roll forward?
Robbie has her hand raised, so we might have a verbal question.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hey, I appreciate your comments, George, and it's encouraging that you guys are talking about maybe net buildable areas. One of the things that struck me on your slide number 17, you have how does the cluster lot option work? You know, you show the open lot, and then you show the conventional subdivision, and then you show the cluster subdivision. And I think it's on this presentation, maybe, Sean, I don't know. I don't know if you want to pull that up, but for me, I looked at that and I was like, well, that looks good. You know, I think one of the issues that I'm aware of is that at times, I mean, one of the guardrails could be show us how many lots you can actually put on this property with a regular subdivision, because that's the number of lots that you can build in a cluster lot subdivision. And I feel like that is something that I'm very aware is an issue, that a lot of times more lots are built within the cluster design than it could possibly be built with a regular subdivision. And I feel like, you know, perhaps there could be some simple language, a simple drawing that shows that, well, you know, like your image here, you know, well, you can put this many regular lots on this, you know, so this is how many lots you can put on it. And if you cluster it, you create that open space. I think sometimes there's confusion also with, we're going to save the geographic features, right? So we're going to cluster the lots up here, but that also that often increases the amount of density that is allowable on that parcel, if you follow me, because you wouldn't be able to build on half of that land that has a 40% slope, for example, or a stream or whatever. So I just think this is like such a simple example, and it kind of solves some substantial issues, in my opinion, just to do like a basic drawing of how many lots can physically fit in a regular subdivision and go by that for your density. So I don't know if you've got, anyway, that's all I wanted to throw that in there. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great, I'm glad the graphic was useful. I think it's a really great suggestion. We had these slides just in the same order I just talked about the issues: open space, character, and sort of yield or density. But since it sounds like both you and George, and maybe everyone, has done some thinking about the yield, I might skip to that. And then it sounds like that will probably dovetail into you guys telling us a little more about some of the connections that George was mentioning, or sort of a different way to think about that buildable area. So if that's okay, I'll sort of run through to the end here, and then we can come back to the open space and character as needed. I know it may feel a little bit like we're jumping around to folks, but I want to kind of start with where people have an interest. So again, don't worry about, is it the right number? Is it going to work everywhere? Don't worry about if everyone's in agreement or not. Just throw it all out here, and we'll take it down and we'll try to evaluate and figure out the best fit. So I'm going to scroll quickly, not to make you dizzy, but just to get us down to the yield. So last time, I think we talked a little bit, and I think Robbie's had some questions and pointed out some issues where, it feels like the density isn't quite working right, or there's more happening than would be if the subdivision were conventional. And we took a stab at explaining it last time, and I don't know, some folks may have grasped that. Some folks may have been like, this is confusing. Others may have felt like it didn't address their concerns. So we took kind of another run at a way to think about it, which I think ended up borrowing the terms that George had just floated. And so I'll go through this quickly and then get to some of the potential solutions that we were thinking about, and then I'll stop talking so that you can tell me about yours. So, kind of one way to think about the yield is sort of this idea of gross and net. And in any piece of property, but I just picked a 2.3 acre site that I made up, the first kind of thing that you can figure out is, okay, what is the maximum number of lots that I could make out of this space that meet the minimum lot size of my current zoning district. And so if we pretend that this square is zoned RS10 or single family, 10,000 square foot minimum lot size, you get to a gross maximum lot yield by just dividing that number by the minimum lot size. And so we get 10. And then in reality, you got to figure out how to design or lay out those 10 lots so that they meet all kinds of other requirements. And this isn't an exhaustive list, and some of these might not apply all the time, but we have subdivision regulations that talk about things like block length and sort of access and other questions. We have stormwater regulations. So, they'll have to incorporate those into their subdivision plan. There are public works standards. If there are going to be roads, they have to meet certain requirements. You got to serve everything with utilities. A big one is often the fire code. Is there access in the right places? Can the emergency vehicles get there? Landscaping requirements. So the owner of a property or anyone who's trying to design a subdivision would sort of start with their gross number, and then they have to identify all the things that apply. And if they submit an application, all those other metro agencies, fire and water services and stormwater and public works, will also be reviewing to make sure that they meet all those requirements. But all those things kind of stack up in layers, and you get a net lot yield, right? So whether you can actually achieve the growth depends on whether you can still fit that many lots after you've met all these other standards. And so sometimes the net lot yield might be your gross maximum, but sometimes it might not be. And that's just going to depend on the conditions of the site. And then someone could go through the exercise of deciding how they wanted, whatever final design they want to come up with. And it may be that they just want bigger lots, or they want to do a street a certain way, or, but in any case, it's never going to be more than the gross, because that's just the sort of the roughest way to calculate it. And, the way all these line up, it might be less. So if we're talking about someone who chooses to use the cluster lot option, right, instead of just doing a subdivision without clustering, they want to choose to use the cluster lot option on this same piece of property. You might assume that you start out in the same place, but you actually don't. So there are different standards in the cluster lot option for how you calculate your gross maximum lot yield. And what they say is that before you calculate how many you can achieve, you subtract 15% of the site. So if I choose to use the cluster lot option for the same development, the way that the maximum gross yield is calculated is I subtract 15%, or in this case, it's about 15,000 square feet, and then I divide that by the minimum lot size of my original zoning. So I'm still referring back to that 10,000 square foot minimum lot size. And in this case, that math comes out to 8.5. When we're talking about lots, we always round down because you can't have part of a lot that meets the minimum lot size. So you either get to the next whole lot or you don't. So this came out to 8.5, which means the maximum number of lots they could propose in this cluster lot subdivision is 8. And then they go through the same exercise that a regular subdivision does of figuring out how many, how all these other regulations apply, how to design it in a way that achieves that. And the net, then you come up with a net cluster lot yield, and it's somewhere between 1 and 8. So the cluster lot standards already hold it lower than what you could technically achieve this gross maximum, right? Zoning hasn't changed. The minimum lot size that we're basing it on hasn't changed. But the calculation of gross yield in a cluster lot option is different. So I think, that's just something to keep in mind. There's already a little bit of adjustment. Now, I think to some of Robbie's questions or some of the ideas that the group might have, maybe that's not the right way to think about how to get to the gross cluster lot yield. Maybe there's a different way you want to do it, or a different percent we should be factoring out. And so staff had come up with a few different alternatives. Maybe it's that 15%. The code sort of describes that 15% that you're subtracting as to account for infrastructure. You could subtract 15% to account for other things. You could have a different percentage. Another way that some communities deal with this issue is this idea of adjusted site area. So you have the area of your site, but maybe you factor out certain kinds of restrained areas. I think John was sharing some of this in the chat. So why don't you subtract a portion of the area that's not usable, and then you calculate how many lots you could achieve. So there's a few different ways that you could do that, and whether you're thinking about it as the not useful areas or the open space. And then finally, we also had sort of the same thought that Robbie suggested, which was maybe you ask for a plan that shows what you could do under the conventional development so that you know what you're comparing to. So those were all thoughts that we had. And I'm actually going to stop sharing because I think last time folks like to be able to see each other kind of larger format as we discussed. And I would love to hear maybe George's proposal or any other ideas or questions that you guys have on this part of it. I saw George's virtual hand up, and then we'll come to Robbie's real hand.
Thank you. I guess the first note that I had on the gross max yield is I feel like maybe the slide we're seeing today is different from the presentation that was part of your email earlier, which is good. I like the improvement of labeling it as gross. But kind of one of my thoughts that I had from the original presentation was that a gross yield of the lot max area, from my perspective, is actually kind of worse than useless. In an academic sense, of part of presentation to community or as part of staff reports, I feel like it's kind of used to browbeat community a bit to increase density, to diminish expectations from the community of adaptation to character And it, in the sense that a gross max yield is never tied to any characteristics of the parcel, sets and kind of artificially inflates entitlement of an applicant. So I understand its usefulness internally for calculations in an academic sense. So we've got to start somewhere for comparison of what could be built. But I feel like as moving beyond that as part of a presentation to the public or what's possible, I feel like it actually is kind of damaging this sense of gross yield is an actual entitlement. And then my other comments or thoughts were I can share some of the stuff that I've found on research on calculating net buildable area. But my thoughts, and again, this may be another can of worms, is there, and you may get to this, has staff looked at maybe comparable metros or other places and how they do calculations of net buildable area and or open space requirements, like model legislation, either through APA or there are places that maybe have had a little bit more success in this. All right, I'm going to stop talking because I've lost my train. Thank you.
Sure. I think all good suggestions. We've done some research, and like I said, we did find some communities that adjusted the site area or tried to figure out net buildable area in different ways. I'm not going to tell you that that's been exhaustive research yet, because we wanted to get, some direction and understanding from this group about what we should be focusing on. But it definitely is an approach that different communities take. And what they factor out or what they sort of adjust for varies, because they all have different sort of regulations about slopes and floodplains and those kinds of conventions. But it's usually an adjustment for some portions of areas that might already be restricted from development in some way. So that's certainly something we could look into more. Robbie, what question did you have?
Thanks, Sean. Basically you're left with 85% of the parcel to then subdivide, is what you're saying, because you take away the 15%. And the code says that then you have to divide that along with the main code regulations for the area. Like, so you don't do you're not supposed to do the smaller units. You're not supposed to take the 85% and then, like, for the one I'm familiar with, RS10 zoning, right? So 10,000 square feet per lot. It sounds to me like the idea is, and I just looked it up on the code, I'm going to paste it in our chat, is that you take the 85% and then you do RS zoning plans on that. That's how you get your lots, how many lots you can build. Then you build your smaller lots and you create open space. Is that, I mean, because that's what it says in the code. I don't, but that's a problematic thing. Is that that's what we're saying, right?
Right. So the number of lots that can be achieved, right, is based on the zoning that is there today, the 10,000 square feet. But the size of those lots can then be, right, exactly. So the 85% is divided by the zoning that's in place, the 10,000 square foot minimum. And then that gives you a number. And then the size of those lots, whatever that number is could then potentially be reduced. So you don't get to divide the 85 by like the 5,000. So you're reading that right, I think.
That's what I wanted to clarify, because I agree with George was mentioning this also. I think the gross number of maximum lots is, I have had that really used as a, I don't know what to say, a major power play by saying, well, look, we can build this many lots. It says so in the code. And they're talking about taking the entire, there's a lot of pressure on neighborhoods, I feel like, to accept that there's this mathematical equation that says, well, we can do this, so we're being great to do, 50 homes instead of, 85 homes here. Give us a break, And I feel like there's got to be a way to simplify this and make it and I don't think the maximum lot thing is useful because it also doesn't take into the consideration that, like, I mean, they have to build huge drainage ponds on these properties for subdivisions, and that goes into the open space, provisions. There's a lot of stuff that's really kind of challenging with that, but I'm gonna stop there. I know you've got a lot to say, so thank you.
Yeah, no, I think that's all. I think you're observing this and making suggestions, I think, in a way that is useful and sort of right in line with the questions that staff has had. So, I think that in general, right, we have, there's zoning and there's the way we sort of talk about what that permits. And I think that an easy way or I don't know if easy is the right word, but one way to talk about it is just that gross mathematical number. But I think what I'm hearing from this group, several of you, is that there needs to be a more sort of realistic or inclusive way of demonstrating or calculating what you can achieve on a site. It's not just the gross. And whether that's asking for the owner or developer to show that by giving kind of two versions of a plan, or whether it's I'm seeing in the chat, but I'm going to tell you I don't have the bandwidth to look at all the details, but some idea of where you factor out certain parts of the site or certain area of the site before you calculate how many lots can be achieved. Does that sound like the gist of what you guys are? Yes, George.
Well, I see other chats going by, and I'm using a phone, so I'm seeing everybody's video feed, but I'm not seeing the chat. So I'm going to go ahead and throw into the audio record for those that what I submitted in the chat was that an incentive of the cluster lot option is to provide a gain in open space. Therefore, some open space requirement must be met from the net buildable area, not the gross area. And then the follow-up to that is that a proposal is bound to the characteristics of the site, and the calculation of max yield should be a formula that first determines the net buildable area. What formula is used may depend on the transect. And an example of an example formula based off of Wisconsin Regional Planning Commission states from the gross acreage of the site, subtract the following, and they list all lands located with an existing street or rights of way, all lands located with an existing utility and railway easements or rights of way, lands located within a floodplain, floodway buffer, all lands located within a wetland, all of the area located within a pond or lake. And then they go on, and I think like some of this is really key for what we're looking at. 50% of lands having a slope between 12 and 20%, all the land having a slope of 20% or greater, and then 20% of the area located within a woodland, a minimum of 1 acre of woodland, and the result would be the net buildable acreage. So I don't mean to just read a bunch of text to people, but those are the kind of things that that look to me like would produce a meaningful net buildable area. Thanks.
No, that's helpful. And if you, George, you may have put that in the chat, or if you want to email it to me after, that will be helpful, because then I can see it and dive through it when I'm able to focus on those suggestions. But I think that's very much in line with what I was sort of hearing, and one way that some of the communities we've looked at go about it. I did want to ask a clarifying question. I'm not sure if I heard you correctly. So if you use that type of approach, right, if the calculation factored those things out, should the open space, like if there's an open space requirement, should that be based on the gross acreage of the site? So in other words, if I have 10 acres and I have to put 10% in open space, this is not what the code says. I'm just using numbers I can divide in my head. I need an acre of open space. Or is your suggestion that first I figure out how much of that 10 acres is buildable, and then the open space is a percent only of the buildable area?
That's a fantastic question. And I think that the first importance for me of the net buildable area was in the function of calculating a net buildable area for a max lot yield. And then the second thing was to give a bar for then demonstrating that the cluster lot option is producing a gain in open space. And so then your question is, which are you using for calculating your percentage of open space? And I don't know, but we can lead into that conversation by saying that, say, the Knox County Planning Department has a draft that says the minimum restricted open space of their requirements shall comprise at least 40% of the gross tract area. But then it goes on to say that at least 25% of the open space shall consist of land that is suitable for building. And then it goes on to say that 75% of the open space shall be in a contiguous tract. So boom, 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 we're getting an opportunity to establish a relationship of the open space requirement to a gross area, then also to a buildable area, and then also start to address the quality of the open space that it produces.
Is that their cluster lot ordinance?
It's a draft ordinance. Some of this stuff is just, we can't properly cite it as, I don't know if they ever adopted it. I don't know if it's 10 years old, but it's just, it's things that I found helpful for people that have sought these types of solutions. And I don't mean to overcomplicate things by stacking formula on formula, but it seems like that might be what we need to do. So,
You know, I was trying to think through following that, and I think I probably will want to look at it. And math on the fly is not my strong suit. I always try to avoid it in planning commission meetings. Sometimes they force me into it, but my brain thinks in sentences, and so when I need to think about formulas, it just helps me to digest. But I am absolutely I would like to look at it, and I think if I'm following correctly, a lot of that makes sense. And I think would certainly be something that staff could explore to try to make all of this more transparent and realistic, and sort of moving toward the actual goal of, as you said, I think demonstrating the open space is an improvement over what you had before. And then we'll have to kind of think about how that gels with the other kinds of restrictions that we have in Metro. To Robbie's question, Knoxville has relatively recently adopted some hillside overlay. And it was they've been involved in that exercise for a long time. I don't have any idea if what George was just referencing was part of that process or something else, but that would be, they've had a lot of different drafts and possibilities floating about on their website because of that effort. So that may be part of where that came from, and we could certainly, if George is able to share that with me, or even just info about what he Googled to find it, I may be able to try to back into what it came from and whether it's been adopted. So that would be great.
Yeah, and I'm sorry to keep speaking, but I didn't mean to have a nest of traps to spring on you. What it is just poor time management on my part, and that I think I fell behind on getting this to what I felt like were the fellow neighbor groups, to then seek feedback from them and then have something to give to you. And I'm just behind, but and you guys are also moving quickly, which I appreciate. So we're just trying to get us all on the same page.
No, you are not behind. This is the purpose of this session, was for you guys to let us know what you're looking at or what you would like us to try to explore. And then there is going to be a period after this meeting where we're doing a lot of digestion and analysis. So I think it's great timing because we can try to look through all of that material and figure out how to distill it down and sort of what makes sense. I saw Ruby had a hand up and then it went down, but I don't want to put you on the spot.
Yeah, no, I was going to ask the question, but it's almost like a whole nother conversation. So, and I'm just going to put my disclaimer out there. I've not been in conversations regarding cluster lots. And John, I think that was like years ago. So we moved on to something else, but just trying to get back into the discussion now. I feel like a lot of terminology. This is just my 2 cents. I appreciate everybody's knowledge and experience on this matter. And Sean, I think you are doing a great job explaining the presentations and the visuals. That's what I more clearly understand. But when we start talking all of this other verbiage, it's kind of like, for those beginning, it's kind of like you're losing me. So it's another conversation going on. I was going to ask the question about the growth. I'm trying to understand what we're doing. I was invited and I'm glad I was invited, but I'm also trying to understand so I can explain to get more neighbors involved. And if I don't understand, I can't explain it to them. And just coming in like this, we'll lose them. And cluster lots may come up and they will not be involved because they don't understand. Because like now, you would lose me, but I can catch up. But I appreciate the conversation. But my question was gross. When you guys were talking about gross, I understand gross to mean this is how many we can build, whether it's right or wrong. That's what that means. Am I correct? The gross is how many can we potentially build? Then we have to go through the regulations, stormwater, fire marshal, all of those other regulations to come up with the net. Am I understanding that simply? That's all I'm trying to make sure I understand.
Yes, I think,
Okay.
you know, and I think the one thing I might sort of clarify there is, and I'm not even sure if this is helpful, but when I think some of the questions that Robbie and George are sort of getting at is that phrase, how many we can build, right? There's the first way to talk about the growth is just the number of boxes that fit. If you had no rules and everything was a square, how many boxes is that? Because if all you're considering is what size those boxes need to be to meet the zoning and how many boxes fit, that's gross. And then
Got it.
the net is actually how many you can build, because at that point it's not just all square, right? So you've run through the exercise of how many of those boxes are achievable.
I think I got that. I was just wanting to make sure because we're talking about the details, the formula that's used to calculate the gross. That's what seems to be a lot of the conversation about, and that's fine. And then what's declared net buildable after you go through all these adding and subtracting, in my mind, kind of like your work check. You get a gross pay. By the time they take out all of these taxes, your net is what you bring home. I just need this as simple as that for me to understand. Then I can go back and get into the gross. You're not paying me enough. You're not doing this. I can go back and get into that. I just want to make sure I don't get lost in the conversation and kind of zoom out, but continue the discussion because I'm sure it'll fall in where I need it. But I just want to make sure I had the basics. But thank you.
No, I think that's a very good way to think about it. What we're asking of this group is pretty challenging, right? Like the planning staff spends all day reading the zoning code, but it's a really dense document. Most people aren't going to do that for fun. And I think being able to describe it in a way that's comfortable for everyone and that relates to something they're familiar with is really helpful. And Ruby, I might actually borrow your sort of metaphor there. You've got gross pay. There's a whole bunch of different things that get subtracted out of that by your employer, your taxes, your health insurance, your whatever, and you get your net pay or your take home. This is very similar. And I think if that's a useful way for people to think about it, they should. And what we're talking about today is actually the nitty gritty of all those withholdings or deductions that come out of your check, and where those should be set and how they work. So I hate to start comparing us to the tax code, but nobody likes that. But I think that's a useful metaphor. So thank you for helping us kind of get it back to that level. I think that's great.
Okay. Thank you. And
Yeah.
I just had an emergency to come up, so I'm going to have to leave. I totally apologize. Okay.
Oh, thanks for being here.
Okay. Bye.
Okay. I see a couple hands up again. Were those relics or are there other thoughts? Should I flip us to some open space slides? Robbie has a question. Yes.
I'll be brief. One of the other issues I'm aware of, and I think that you will know, but I thought maybe it was in the community character manual, there's a whole section about cluster lots should be located near major corridors, major transportation corridors, throughways, shops, etc. And I just wondered if I think where they're placed is also a critical issue, certainly in my neighborhood. And I didn't know if that was something we might get into, or if you had any comments on that, Sean. That's all I got. Thanks.
Yeah, so I think at a high level, and we touched on this briefly last time, the sort of all the different ways that we can talk about clustered development. And different kinds of clustered development. So certainly our community character policies do talk about clustering development along corridors or in centers. I think this tool, by virtue of where it applies, right? It applies when land is subdivided. This isn't something that affects how more dense like apartments or other kinds of developments along corridors happen. That's usually a function of the zoning. But I think you're right to think about, are there locations where this makes more sense, or where you're more likely to achieve good open space versus others? And we could talk about that in terms of the community character policies, or I think George had mentioned transects. That's one way you could think about, like, is that where the cluster lot option should be an option? Or, you know, even more broadly, like a lot of our zoning standards in Nashville, there are standards you can utilize if you're in the urban core, which we sometimes people call the urban zoning overlay area. And some of those standards are not available to areas outside of the urban core. Or we have standards that are allowed in the urban services district, but not in the general services district. So I think you're right to think about this is an option. Should there be some specification in our standards about where it's an option, if that makes sense?
I actually thought there already was. I thought it was actually already written in Nashville Next. Maybe it's just T4. I don't know. I'll try to find that, but I thought it was actually already documented somewhere that that's where these kinds of developments should go. But I'll try to find that. So thank you.
Yeah. Anna works in our long range division, so sometimes she can help me where I'm missing parts of the policy. Do you have anything else you might add there, or that?
Yeah, I don't think we get in that specific in policy to say cluster lot development should happen here. We do talk about T4 being urban and therefore concentrating development. So there might be some overlap there. If you can find the exact language, I can try to meet it out to explain. But typically our land use policy doesn't get into specifics of where zoning tools should be applied that specifically. You're muted, Sean.
Sorry, I see a lot of hands go up at once. And then I'm always like, who do we go to first? John, do you want to speak next? And then.
Yeah, I'm real quick. Twana is at Vanderbilt Medical Center this morning, but she is connected via the chat room. If you all make sure to look at the chat, because she's always got lots to say. And this is the only time we don't get to hear her. And she's got her mask on because, you know, she's doing the social distancing thing properly. It's not that she wants to hold us up or anything. That's all I got.
No, very much appreciate, Twana, that you're making time to fit us in the middle of everything else you have going on. We capture the whole chat, so we're able to see that, even if it's scrolling quickly now. So anything you put there, we can definitely see and refer back to. And it's great if you want to share your comments there. Oh, I don't know what that is.
She has some specific questions if you can look for them.
Okay. Oh, Anna, can you scroll through and see if we can find those while we're going?
I will. Yeah, I'll do that. And go ahead.
and just interrupt me when you find them, Anna. I saw, Catherine, did your hand go up and then come down?
Hi guys, can you hear me? Hello, good morning. Just to Robbie's point quickly, I'm wondering if that's pointing out maybe the discussion we had last time about maybe the terminology being off with the cluster, using it, the phrase cluster, when Robbie was talking about using it along commercial corridors. And maybe that's kind of what Nashville Next was speaking about in that situation. Maybe commercial or high intensity residential uses instead of more subdivision development. That's all.
Okay, so I have a first question from Twana. I think previously there's a lot of comments in support of our conversation, so we'll get that noted when we get the chat transcript. But the first question I see is, how is this more beneficial than an SP where we support more density on a smaller part of the property?
So, well, they're different in that an SP would involve a rezoning, and this is a tool that exists in the code that you do not have to rezone to utilize. So whether you think it's better or that it's working better currently is, I think, sort of up for discussion, right? That's why we're here. But I think that this is something that's there even if they're not asking for an SP. And someone can propose a development that meets these standards, and there is not the kind of public hearing and planning commission and council decisions and discussion that we would have with a specific plan. This just goes through as a subdivision proposal. And I'm seeing a kind of follow-up question in the chat. Is it a tool for base zoning districts? The only time you can use this tool is if the property is zoned R, 1 or 2 family, or RS, single family. So if someone is seeking a different zoning, right, an SP, then you can achieve many of the goals that we're talking about here, right? They could propose a development with different sizes of lots and a lot of open space, and that would be a zoning that we could look at. But this is already permitted by the zoning that's in place. And so I think the question is, knowing that those standards are there, are they working the way that we would expect? Are they getting the open space that people want to see? And if not, do they need to be adjusted? Or do they need to be indicated that they're only appropriate in certain locations or on certain sizes of sites? So that's kind of how does that help? And if there are other questions that we've missed from Tawana, we can get to those also. But yes, Robbie.
I think that's a great point, Tawana. And I almost feel like sometimes SP zoning would be fairer to the community, because then we would get a hearing in the council. And it's very difficult to try to fight a cluster lot development, because you get to go to the planning commission, and they already have, if they've done a certain amount of the requirements, sometimes, the planning commission might not feel like they even have an option to say no, and if it was SP, the neighbors would have a much larger opportunity to express their opinion and fight it if they don't like it.
Yeah, the only thing I would say there, right, is that if someone is already zoned for R or RS zoning, they can propose a subdivision and meet regulations and be approved. And there's not if this tool did not exist, we might be missing an opportunity to try to improve the development pattern. I'm not going to tell you that it always improves the development pattern as it's currently configured. I think if it did, we wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation. But to some extent, right, I think that's the challenge. It is an optional tool in the code. And to the extent that people try to use it, the standards are calibrated correctly, it does potentially drive a better development outcome, or it could, than just a subdivision where they didn't use it. And just because they're, we're not always in a position where someone's asking for a rezoning. And if they're already sitting on zoning that is single family or two family, they don't necessarily have to, which means that if this tool isn't there, are we losing an opportunity to try to get a slightly better development pattern or more meaningful open space? So that's just something to think about. I think it is a trade-off, right? But that's part of why having the standards calibrated correctly could help, is that we could potentially achieve something better. But if we make the hurdle to do it too complicated, or it starts having the effect of really drastically impacting how the site planning works, people may choose not to. So that's something we're trying to keep in mind as well, is that we want to make sure it's an appealing tool. Because to the extent that it's working well, we want people to use it. But yes.
Do you think there's any chance that it could be moved into an approval process like SP? Because, like, for example, and I won't get into my situation, but I mean, like the slide you show where all the homes are smaller and they're clustered in this area and there's all this open space, it's like, yay, I mean, that's great, and I'm sure that happens in certain situations, but if it is being taken advantage of, it seems like if the cluster lot option actually had to go through a hearing at council with public input, that would really change things, and people could say, yeah, we love this idea, we know it needs to be developed, look at all this open space, or hey, this looks like SP zoning that we didn't approve, Anyway, I'm gonna be quiet. I'm sorry, I'm talking too much.
No, that's okay. I think that, sorry, I'm just completely lost my train of thought. I mean, I think one thing to keep in mind is sort of our hope, right, is that there's a way to achieve better open space, to protect more environmental features. We sort of truly believe that the picture that Robbie keeps referencing, right, that where you get the lots all grouped together and there is open space, that's a better outcome, right? That overall in Nashville, that's better. But I think we also, want to be careful that it's balanced right. Is that exact pattern better everywhere? I don't know. But I think on the whole, to the extent that we can get development grouped into a smaller portion of a site, entitlements that are already the zoning sitting out there, if that's a possibility and we can get people to do it and the open space that it's protecting is meaningful, however we define that, I think that's a win for Metro, because it, we get less impervious surface, we get better stormwater control, we get fewer miles of road to maintain, we get different kinds of housing. But I do think that's why it's important to sort of explore the standards that exist. Whether, I think an SP, essentially you're writing these standards, right? So, if you've seen SPs that worked well, then maybe those are standards that we want to have as part of this tool. If you think about a site where you saw an SP and you liked the outcome, what about that site was appealing? Because those are just zoning standards also. They're just zoning standards that were proposed in that instance, but that doesn't mean we can't, if we think it worked well, let's borrow it and make it a zoning standard that applies to everybody. But I think that's kind of, you got to think about those kinds of specifics and sort of what we can pull out of that and how we might plug it in here. Okay, so I want to be conscious of time. Are you guys? I mean, I feel like this is useful to staff, and I'm getting a lot of good questions. Are you guys feeling good about just discussing for the last 15 minutes or so here? Yes. Okay. So we'll keep rolling. I saw John Stern's real hand, and then George, you've been waiting very patiently, so we'll come to you right after John. Yeah.
And I may be setting George up for the big home run. But Robbie, I think that, one of the things to think about is where this thing came from. It was created, and I thought it was done in the 90s. I don't remember. But it was done in hopes of saving sensitive environmental features, slopes, sinkholes, buffers before we had buffers for streams and such, uh, which we all supported in the neighborhoods, but unfortunately they allowed the developers to go down 2 zoning districts in size with the same number of lots. And so, like we were talking about at the beginning, comparability and compatibility with other neighborhoods, existing neighborhoods, was completely off. What I'm really interested in finding out was there any benefit to this for the community? The benefits I'm thinking of are the saving of natural features, less pavement, more open space. I'd really like to know that before we, create a major political push, because this ain't going to be easy. The reason they got the original was because the developers have significant political power, and both here and at the state. In Metro, at this point, I think we have more power as community members, but we still have problems at the state that we'll have to tread lightly upon. I hope that helps a little bit, and I hope it sets up George for the big one. Yeah, baby, batter up.
George, you're up.
I'm sure to disappoint. Thank you, John. My question was going back to, well, first of all, I'd like to say I'm glad to hear that there are other communities that maybe have different experience with SPs, because I don't mean to pour cold water on it, but my community in general, I would have to say, has not. I agree with John in the intentions of a cluster lot option where was the production of a gain in open space and a decrease in footprint for all the gains that we talk about, whether that it provides buffering and encapsulation of development so that you insulate it from a character, because you are allowing them the increased density, which is then therefore going to produce something that changes in character from parcels around it that may be zoned the same. So going back to my notes, not to jump around a little bit, but Sean, you'd mentioned earlier that I think there was a count had been produced out of staff of cluster lot applications. And not to give staff more homework, but maybe there are patterns in where those cluster lot options come up, and maybe there are patterns to which ones produce more controversy than others, which is obviously why the commission is asking us to look at this. So those patterns may be helpful in understanding where the amendments would produce the greatest improvements in the tool. And then second of all, not to pick on Sean's presentation on the illustration, but go back to the illustration that we talked about at the very beginning, the one on page 17 with the demonstration of the rectangular lots. I am so obsessive that I printed that off and I got out the ruler. And
Oh, it wasn't to scale.
I know, but this is where we're going to run into some of the problem is the point that I'll illustrate is that the example of the conventional subdivision, when I measured that in square area, produced 12% of open space, which is nearly what the cluster lot option does. And then the example of the cluster lot option measuring that illustration produced 45% open space. So the idea that if you're going to go denser, like John was discussing in a cluster lot option, then we're discovering that the 15% is not enough yield in order to get what we want out of the tool. I've run out of track, so hopefully that was enough of a point. But I'll come back. I have other questions, but I'm going to take a minute before I get into the next one. Thank you.
Yeah, no, so first of all, lots of cartoons. Y'all are applying a level of detail to my cartoons that I was hopeful that that would illustrate something just conceptually, and wasn't worrying so much about whether it yielded anything correctly in real life. So bear with me there. But you asked about sort of data and trends. And so when we went through and tried to, it involved manually checking every single one of those plans. Most of the time, this tool gets utilized in the T3 suburban transect, like far and away. That's where it's most commonly used, at least in the last 4 years that we looked at. There were only maybe 1 or 2 that occurred in the T4 urban transects, and a couple, maybe 1 or 2 in T2 rural. So it is, at least so far, most commonly used in the T3 suburban transect. Just based on the cases that we were able to find and look at. To your question about the trends, I think one thing we try to be really conscious of is that receiving comment in opposition to something is not always a full indicator of whether it's working well or not. And a failure to receive opposition doesn't necessarily suggest that it's all perfect. So we have to take that with a grain of salt, but it is an indicator for us. So I was hopeful, right, that when I looked, maybe we would discover that the opposition was always on sites that that were really small, or maybe it was always concern when the site was really large, or maybe, it was always concern if the open space was left. And it is almost identical. The cases that had no opposition ranged from 2 to 140 acres, and the cases with opposition ranged from 3 to 170 acres. The number of lots was a similar range. Which made it sort of challenging to identify, like, if we just fix this one thing, it will work better for everyone. And I think to your point, George, formulas over formulas, it's a little bit, we got to get it balanced right. But exactly what balance we need that's what we're trying to figure out. And so, I think all of this feedback has been super helpful. I see a comment in the chat, I think it's Robbie, about this is happening a lot now in East Nashville. Let's touch base offline, because I feel like maybe we're having, a disconnect in exactly what kind of development this is. I want to make sure that I'm aware of the cases that you're seeing, because they may not be showing up in our data in the same way. Because I think, so let's circle back to that. Okay, I have no idea where we are with Tawana's questions or hands. Anna, can you help me?
I was going to say that Tawana has a question I wanted to get back to. If the cluster law option is sought by a developer, does the community have any mechanism for saying, no, we prefer A, B, or C?
So as of right now, this comes through as a subdivision proposal. And if in reviewing the proposal, the Planning Commission does hold a hearing, but they are evaluating whether it meets the technical standards of the subdivision regulations and the zoning code. Tawana's nodding. She's run into this a lot. And if they do, it's happening under the existing zoning and the existing subdivision regulations. And so they're in a position where they typically need to approve that. Now, if they determine that it doesn't meet a standard, right, then they have a finding under which to disapprove it. So, to the extent that they're finding things meet the standards, and it's not an outcome that we would expect, that might mean the standards need to be adjusted. So that's kind of how that works. Yes, more, Anna, or should I go to John Stern?
I don't see any more questions from Tawana, so I think we're good to go over to John.
Okay, John.
Yeah, I want to touch base your comments about, first of all, I get dizzy when people start talking about transects. I don't know if that's a universal reaction, but I I don't know what the hell they are, and don't understand. I understand generally, but they drive me nuts. And so when we're talking about the most cases were in the T3 transect, which is suburban, I'm guessing. Uh, and there weren't many in T2, which was rural. Well, there's another reason for that. There's a whole lot more T3 than there is T2 out there. In our neighborhood, it sure is. And it's kind of it's kind of challenging. Um, is there a way that we could see some more data, especially imagery about how it's being, before and after, what's being saved, what's not being saved? Uh, you know, when they build stuff, when I'm looking at stuff being built out here, they're building on ridges, and they're building on sensitive features. I know they are, but they're just knocking it all down. They come in, slice all the trees, grind them up. Well, they sell the hardwood, and then they grind up the rest of the stuff, and that goes for mulch. And then they blast the rock. And well, no, I'm sorry, they take the topsoil off, disturbing all the topsoil, building huge piles. I got one right over here. Uh, and then they blast, take the rock out that they need, and then they start building their houses or their offices or whatever. And they're not saving anything. It's not natural areas that, and I'm talking about good developers, guys that have all the things we want: walkable neighborhoods, tree-lined streets, rear-loaded garages, really nice stuff, but they rape the land to get us there. And that's one of the biggest challenges we've got. Is it's not so much, well, cluster lots are a problem, but we manage that by requiring rezonings that are SP or regulatory SPs. It would be nice to have the tool in place, a cluster lot tool in place that works, so that all of the existing base zoned R and RS subdivisions uh, can 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 benefit the community rather than just kind of dumping more people and cars and water and everything into the creeks and such. That's so more data, please.
Yeah. So I think, there's been a bunch of comments and questions in the chat that I'm seeing out of the corner of my eye about T3 or T2 or how all that's working. So we'll kind of look into that and circle back. I think to your point, John, one sort of question is that there's a lot of development occurring. I mean, even of subdivision proposals that the commission considered, only half of them use this tool, right? So, over the last 4 years, half of them opted to develop without the constraints of a cluster lot requirement, which means that there was no open space required in those subdivisions. Whatever they included, they just chose to include. And I think you're raising some questions about kind of standards about grading or other kind of requirements, many of which actually don't live in the zoning code. They live in the part of Metro's code of laws that applies to stormwater and water services. So I think there are certainly a whole range of kind of issues or questions around development and how it occurs in Nashville. And not all of those are going to be, I hate to break it to you, but even if we figure this out, we're not going to magic bullet everything with just this tool. To very much to your point, John, I think you're right that to the extent that we can get a tool that works, that meets the goals, I think we would hope that it would be used so that we get better results than we're getting currently from some of these base-owned subdivisions. Yeah.
That's great. I forgot I was going to include include a pitch for Valerie, but it looks like she's on another phone call. What I think you may find with the number of rezonings that were being questioned or were being fought or whatever the case may be, I'm guessing there were neighborhood groups, active neighborhood groups near most of the ones that had been questioned. Uh, that's usually what one sees, or what we used to see. I don't know what's going on necessarily today for the last 5 years, but active neighborhood groups are a factor in the number of challenges that you probably see down at the Planning Commission.
Thank you. Okay, so we're coming up on 1 o'clock. I think there's been a lot of questions and ideas and detail that we certainly couldn't digest in this meeting. And I think many of you probably have other questions and ideas and suggestions. Basically, what's going to happen next is that we're going to go back and try to review everything and take some time to think it through and sort of figure out how your different suggestions could work together as a single set of zoning standards, see what kind of overlaps or questions we're hearing from the other stakeholder groups, where we might have points of agreement or outstanding sort of points where we're on different pages. We'll kind of parse through all that. And you are certainly welcome to send us ideas or comments or questions that you have in the interim. But there may be a period here where staff is kind of doing that analysis and work, and you won't hear from us as much. And then we will try to get you some specific proposals that you can review and give us your thoughts on. And we'll figure out the best format to get to bring folks together to discuss those and give us your ideas and to hear from the other stakeholder groups as well, potentially. So when we have this recording, I'll send it to everybody so that you can reference it. If you have details or reference materials, I would very much appreciate if you email them to me, because then I can think through them all carefully. And we'll try to look at the questions in the chat that we didn't get to and follow up with folks. And Tawana has a hand up, which probably means that we need to look in the chat for a question or a comment that she has. I'm scrolling.
I think Tawana's just letting us know that there are a couple of good SPs that she would like to share at some point, and the lessons learned from those.
Yeah. So we will, Tawana, I'll follow up with you by email and maybe try to find a time for us to connect, and then we can figure out how to share that information with the group as well. We've had a little bit in one of our other stakeholder groups, a little bit of exchange over email, which I think has been useful to them because they can do that on their own time, right? Instead of having to come together in the middle of a workday. So we'll explore different ways to kind of share information with each other that are useful for you guys, and then we'll definitely digest everything and get you some proposals to review. So I want to thank everyone, and I see a note. Good cluster out examples would be helpful. Also, I have a couple that we didn't get to today. So I want to thank everyone for chatting with us and for making time for this conversation. And we will reach out again when we have the recording, and then with updates as we go forward from there. Thanks all.
Thank you.